So at Stanford, we use focused ultrasound clinically to treat bone metastases, to treat uterine fibroids, off-label to treat soft tissue tumors, including desmoid tumors, and soon we'll be translating from the research setting to the clinical setting to treat essential tremor as well. And the model we have at Stanford is I am the radiologist that performs the different procedures. So as a starting point, I think one of the lessons I've learned is the value of targeting an unmet need. It kind of goes without saying, but in some ways it maybe bears repeating, honestly, because some of the applications we have, it's a crowded market in some places. So for example, for uterine fibroids, there's a lot of other good applications, and you really have to find the right patient and the right fibroid and to make sense there. And for that patient population, it works great. But there are a lot of other alternatives. A couple of examples of areas where there's a definite unmet need. One is pancreatic cancer, where colleagues mostly in Asia and Europe have started using HIFU for that. Our own examples with desmoid tumors. And really what I mean by an unmet need is where the alternatives have limited effectiveness. So for example, for desmoid surgery, there's about a 50% recurrence rate after surgery. Radiation has a risk of, a not insignificant risk of causing secondary malignancy, and it's not perfectly effective either. The systemic therapies carry systemic toxicities and again aren't that effective. And so it's a fairly easy sell to the referring oncologists, the referring surgeons. Our surgeons are actually happy to not be operating on these patients, and so they refer the patients. We work together both clinically and academically on these. It's worked out very well, and I think, frankly, pancreatic cancer is another obvious example in that realm where the number of patients that have the cancer that are actually surgical candidates is fairly limited, and so the oncologists and surgeons would be happy to have another alternative there. So really targeting an unmet need, that's made my life a lot easier, and frankly, I'm doing more off-label treatments of desmoids than I am doing fibroids or bone metastases, even though those are FDA approved. So it's an odd thing, but it really reflects the fact that when I go to an insurance company, for example, and try to get authorization for a desmoid treatment, and they say, well, I don't see focused ultrasound on the guidelines for treating desmoids. I say, well, this person's already had everything on the guidelines. What else do you want them to do? And I win that argument. So it's a nice way to think about it. Team building. I think, well, you'll probably hear this from everybody here, but the team that we work with, first of all, it makes the day itself go by more easily, but honestly, they all contribute, and they're all contributing in ways, honestly, outside of maybe their area of expertise sometimes, because they're so engaged. They see the value of the treatment for the patients, and we try to make it fun and engaging, but also focused on the patient. Obviously, the clinical colleague that I mentioned is essential for both referrals and long-term management. That's what the model that we have. Other places where it's the clinician doing the treatment, obviously that's not so essential there. For example, if you have a neurosurgeon doing ET treatments, obviously he or she's doing the long-term management of that patient as well. But in my setting, I work closely with colleagues in urology, in orthopedic surgery, in gynecology, in oncology, and we manage the patients together. Obviously, an anesthesiologist, we do most of our treatments under general anesthesia, except for the fibroid treatments, which are done under conscious sedation. Not all anesthesiologists are comfortable in the MR suite. And I've been very lucky to have excellent anesthesiologists working with me. Frankly, the patients wake up and all they want to do is talk about how great their anesthesia was. I'm kind of secondary to the whole thing afterwards. And frankly, I've benefited as well from our anesthesiologists being not just generalists, but also specialists in regional anesthesia. And so sometimes when the patient wakes up, they're able to help with that immediate post-operative pain with a local block. The patient goes home, and for those first few days where they have some swelling after the treatment, they're pain-free or much reduced pain. One thing that sometimes could be overlooked, I think, we've really benefited from having a physicist/engineer who really is very knowledgeable, Rochelle Baton, about focused ultrasound present in all of our treatments. It's kind of analogous to radiation oncology, where there's a radiation physicist available for treatment planning and so forth, especially as we start doing off-label applications, and where we're kind of designing our own treatment plans and modifying what the software thinks is the right way to go for each individual patient's case. It's really invaluable to bounce ideas off of somebody like that who understands the technology, who understands the physics, and it makes, I think, for a much more effective treatment and increases the safety of the treatment as well, and again, in particular for these off-label applications. So there's different strategies. Again, I mentioned the strategy that we have at Stanford where it's one user treating various indications. So if you look at FUS in the center, we're using FUS to treat neurosurgery, so I collaborate with the neurosurgeons, with the oncologists, with the gynecologists. I'm involved in some of the preclinical trials as well and in strategizing about future direction. So that's kind of the model that we have. The advantages being that I'm the expert in how to use FUS at Stanford, and so if new people want to learn the different applications, I can help train them. And it's one device being used, so rather than, let's say, multiple devices in multiple different areas, I guess there's a cost saving associated with that. It's great to be able to drive research that way because I can see where, for example, something needs to be improved and can turn around to my colleagues in engineering and talk about how we can improve things. And there's a direct translation back and forth between these two things. But as I mentioned, this approach does require that you have strong relationships with the referring physicians, and something we've been fortunate to develop. We've used this approach in, for example, to establish a fibroid center where every week we see patients with gynecologists, with interventional radiologists, and focus ultrasound is one of the options that each of these patients sees. So a patient comes in and over the course of about an hour to an hour and a half sees 3 doctors together, gets a very thorough physical exam, history, we review their MRI and talk with them about their goals and also their treatment options. If it's a dozen fibroids, UAE or surgery makes perfect sense. But if it's really that, what I call the Goldilocks fibroid for FUS, where I feel like I can do as good of a job as UAE or myomectomy, hysterectomy, then of course we direct the patient to the least invasive approach. And that's worked very well. The patients are very satisfied with the care, and frankly, I think all of us would wonder, the patients spend an hour with 3 doctors, so they're basically getting 3 hours of physician time. I mean, usually when we go to the doctor ourselves, it's maybe 10, 15 minutes of physician time. So it's a pretty thorough evaluation. The patients really seem to benefit from it and enjoy the opportunity. And we've taken that model and done that just from the Fibroid Center. We now have a Desmoid Clinic where we see patients once a month. It's at least the orthopedic oncologist and me. And then we also, if the patient hasn't seen a medical oncologist or a radiation oncologist, we bring those people in as well. And it's almost like a tumor board setting where the patient gets a very thorough evaluation and, again, gets a discussion about the pros and cons of the various options. And FUS has basically become really considered a first-line approach there. If the patient can get focused ultrasound, we prefer that just because it's a local therapy for a local disease. So it seems to make a lot of sense in the oncologist's mind, in our minds. And if there's, for some reason, they can't get it, then we route them back to some of the more standard approaches. For the movement disorders clinic that we're establishing, it's the same approach where the patient will come in and see the neurosurgeon and me together, ideally, and they talk about, of course, DBS is appropriate for a lot of the patients. Certainly, if they haven't tried medical management, we're supposed to be using this for medically refractory cases, whether DBS or FUS, and SRS radiosurgery is an option as well. And moving forward, right now, of course, prostate's in a research phase, but one can imagine a similar setting where with urology, the collaboration, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this later from the Duke experience, but the patients that are appropriate for surveillance with the urologist, those that are appropriate for surgery or radiation, but as we gain more experience with focal ablation to route patients into that category as well. The advantage of this model that I'm describing is there's a halo effect, and it's a very real effect. So, for example, for gynecology and for interventional radiology, patients come in part because of the thorough evaluation they get, in part because they're excited about FUS. Not all of them qualify. As I said, I'm looking really for that ideal fibroid where I feel I can be as effective as others. And that gives the patient an opportunity to hear from experts in embolization, experts in minimally invasive surgery. And rather than what they heard from Dr. Google, they actually get to talk to somebody that's done 1,000 embolizations and can say, yeah, the last time I had that side effect happened to me was 8 years ago. It puts things in the context when they get to talk to an expert. And as a result, it's a rising tide lifts all boats. Those guys are doing more surgery, they're doing more embolization, and the clinic has been very successful. They also buy into this. I don't have to go and convince the gynecologist that FUS is effective. They see it in our own patients. They see how the patients are doing afterwards, and frankly, they often route the patients to me. Oh, I've got a great case for you. Can this patient be treated with FUS? Can we try FUS on this patient? It's great to have that kind of collaboration. It's a clinical collaboration. It also is a research opportunity as well, and so we've established those direct ties with these different groups. Of course, there's another model, for example, where a neurosurgeon does the neurosurgical treatment. I think the advantage there is that that expert can really drive forward that particular application and that particular let's say within neurosurgery, but it doesn't necessarily mean that because the neurosurgical application is progressing that you're also seeing the same growth in oncology or gynecology, because you need separate champions in each of those areas. So there's pros and cons, I think, to each of these different approaches, whether dispersed or central. I tried to brainstorm a little bit about this, about new application development, and there's really two different approaches. One is a research approach, and one is an off-label approach, that, at least that I thought of. So, for example, on the research side, if you wanted to take an approach of developing a new application for which there is no label, what do you need to do? Well, you need to get your IRB to sign off on it. In our institution, we also need the FDA to give us an investigational device exemption to let us proceed. Somebody needs to pay for the procedure, so you got to get a grant from somewhere, from the foundation, from the NIH, from the vendor. Because it's a new application, the device manufacturer has to decide that it's part of their business plan and that they want to support it. And I guess there's maybe a set process there, the outcome. Your goal is at some point to not have this be an off-label application. So phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, maybe you go through a PMA or amend an existing PMA. So you can imagine, for example, for osteoid osteomas, you could go down this pathway of various clinical trials, and maybe at the end of the day you end up with an amendment to the current bone label that says you can use this for metastases and for osteoid osteoma. That's one approach. But sometimes that I've done a couple of IDEs. One time it just took 3 months. That seemed relatively painless. One time it was a year and 2 rounds of review and very time consuming. And then the grant funding itself, you have to convince somebody that developing a new application, sometimes you get asked, well, isn't this something the device manufacturer should be funding? Why should the NIH fund a new application? So there's pros and cons to this approach, but at least it's kind of a set approach. And it has kind of a light at the end of the tunnel. The off-label approach, first of all, in order for this to work, what we've done with this, we've used it for osteoid osteomas off-label, we've used it for vascular malformations, we've used it for desmoid tumors, as I mentioned, and there has to be a real clinical need there. So for example, for vascular malformations, we treat the ones that they can't see under ultrasound, and so the standard ultrasound-guided sclerotherapy isn't an option. So when we go to the insurance company and they say, why are you doing MR-guided focused ultrasound? I'm saying, well, I can only see this under MRI. I could do MR-guided cryo, I could do MR-guided something, but I need the MR. I might as well use the focused ultrasound that I have them on there when I'm diagnosing the thing, to also treat it. Same as I mentioned before for desmoids when there's no other alternative. But this off-label approach means that for each individual case, you have to go through an appeals process and an authorization process. And so it is time consuming. And so maybe that year or more that was spent on the research side, it gets divided up piece by piece by piece for each individual patient. And one question is, when does that ever end? If there is no change to the label to actually include some of these new applications, are you always going to be doing an appeals process in perpetuity? That's tiresome. And so you have to think about how are you going to overcome that. Is that going to be through retrospective or prospective research on the patients that you're treating? Do you establish a clinical registry, again, using, for example, we've talked about the osteoid osteoma model, or perhaps with a fibroid model where people are thinking about doing a registry versus a trial. But at the end of the day, you want to have some way where you have both an approval and insurance authorization. And each of these approaches has its advantages and disadvantages. I think one gets you to treating patients faster, the off-label approach. The other is more time-consuming initially, but maybe has a more set pathway going forward. I will say that our institution as well, the off-label approach also requires buy-in from the hospital to allow you to do compassionate use, or it's not that as a physician you can kind of willy-nilly decide to do whatever you want to do. You have to have some buy-in from the hospital that this makes sense. One final thing just to mention, we've also experienced this, that research pays, and it's not just in terms of the actual research itself, but I'll talk about a little bit about the finances. So for example, for ET, for the essential tremor phase 3 study, the advantages of participating in that trial, of course we gained experience using the device. It gave us an opportunity to establish a strong team of neurosurgeons, anesthesiologists, the physics team that was involved, the technologists. Now that the device has transitioned to FDA approval and we're going to be using it clinically, that team's in place. So of course it's a tremendous advantage to hit the ground running. Sites that didn't have that experience are going to have to gain that experience over time. It also gives us an opportunity to do translational research. As we do the treatments, we see the areas that could be improved. We need new sequences for targeting. Well, of course, the thermometry, as you've heard this various sessions here, we could do volumetric thermometry. We need a brain coil, those kinds of things, and so we can participate in that. The one thing I'll mention as well is that one of the analyses that we did as we looked, for example, to buying other devices, is we went back and said, well, what's the return on investment? Because the hospital invested in this technology before it was FDA approved. They went out on a limb, because not all hospitals will do that, to invest in a device that is only being used for research. And what we were able to do in retrospect is to go back to them and say, well, because you did that, a big chunk of the cost of the device got paid for by the research itself. And so now that you're transitioning over to doing clinical care, we feel, based on some actually fairly conservative estimates of the number of patients and so forth, you can basically a couple of years, 1 to 2 years after getting FDA approval, we should have broken even or moved into the black. So that's a nice thing to be able to say when you then say, okay, I'd like some more money to do something else. To say the last time you invested in this, it worked out very well for you. And so just a hint there that research pays not just in terms of the research interest itself, but also in terms of paying off some of the capital costs associated with this. So in conclusion, finding an unmet need, building a team, and I can't emphasize enough collaborating with the clinical experts. I don't have the right answer for new application development off-label versus the FDA approach. It may be a hospital-specific, it may be an application-specific answer there. And then to emphasize at the end that research pays off in many ways, both in terms of basic financial ways and in terms of the new application, the new technology that gets added to the application. Thanks very much.